Good morning from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. You're looking at a live view of Launch Complex 39A, where a Falcon 9 rocket is vertical at this hour, awaiting a static fire test or hold down test firing, which is currently scheduled for 5:45 a.m. Eastern Time, 10:45 a.m. UTC, a little less than 45 minutes from now. This is in preparation for the next launch of crew members to the International Space Station. That launch is scheduled from this launch pad on Florida Space Coast early Monday at 1:45 a.m. Eastern Time. This test firing a key milestone, a prerequisite before SpaceX and NASA can proceed into the final preparations for launch early next week. This mission will be carrying a crew of 4 up to the ISS for a planned 6-month expedition. Those 4 crew members are not aboard the Crew Dragon spacecraft on top of the Falcon 9 rocket right now. They actually went out to the pad earlier tonight, overnight, for what's known as the dry dress rehearsal. They rode in SpaceX's Tesla Model X automobiles from their crew quarters at Kennedy Space Center out to pad 39A. They climbed into the Crew Dragon capsule, got into their seats, all in the name of practice or a rehearsal for the motions they'll go through on launch day, Sunday night into Monday morning. As you're seeing now in our live view of pad 39A, the crew access arm is retracting away from the Crew Dragon spacecraft. That's the arm that the astronauts used earlier tonight to board the Crew Dragon spacecraft, and then they exited out of the spacecraft back to the launch pad service structure on that same arm. But with no astronauts on board, that crew access arm is not necessary, not part of this static fire test, and it's now being retracted away from the vehicle, just as it would during the actual launch countdown. The next milestone after the retraction of the crew access arm will be the start of propellant loading on board the Falcon 9 rocket. That is scheduled to begin at T-minus 35 minutes. That will involve loading about 1 million pounds of rocket-grade kerosene, known as Rocket Propellant 1, or RP1, into both stages of the Falcon 9 rocket. Alongside the kerosene will be liquid oxygen, the super cold oxidizer that the Merlin engines on the Falcon 9 rocket consume in mixture with the kerosene fuel. High-pressure helium will also be loaded into the vehicle. That helium is the pressurant gas used to maintain proper pressures inside the propellant tanks as the propellants, as the fuel and oxidizer are consumed by the engines. This hold down test firing we expect to last around 7 seconds. That's the typical length for one of SpaceX's Falcon 9 static fire tests. Hold down clamps out at pad 39A will keep this 215-foot tall, 65-meter tall rocket firmly on planet Earth. It's not going anywhere this morning. Again, there are no crew members also on board the rocket, so the entire launch pad area is evacuated for this test firing. Now about 40 minutes and 30 seconds from the time of the static fire test. SpaceX rolled the Falcon 9 rocket with the Crew Dragon spacecraft on board out to pad 39A earlier this week, lifted it vertical about 24 hours ago on pad 39A for the final steps to prepare it for launch next week. This mission is designated Crew 6. It's the 6th operational crew rotation flight to the International Space Station to be performed by SpaceX, and the 9th SpaceX human spaceflight mission overall. That includes the 6 revenue-earning crew rotation flights for NASA, as well as 2 fully commercial astronaut missions, one called Inspiration 4 that went into low Earth orbit, and then one for Axiom Space last year that actually docked with the International Space Station for a short duration stay. And the 9th flight in that tally is the original, the very first Crew Dragon human spaceflight mission, Demo 2, back in May of 2020. That was the first Dragon mission to carry people into orbit, a test flight for NASA. This spacecraft, Crew Dragon Endeavour, on top of the Falcon 9, is going to space next week for the 4th time, and it's actually the oldest human-rated Dragon in SpaceX's fleet. It flew on the Demo 2 mission back in 2020, and most recently flew on that Axiom Space Axiom 2 mission, or Axiom 1 mission rather, back in April of 2022. So now less than 4 minutes from the expected start time for propellant loading in preparation for this static fire test. Now less than 35 minutes from the expected ignition time for this morning's static fire test at Kennedy Space Center. At this time, propellants should be loading into the Falcon 9 rocket out at Pad 39A. This process begins with flowing kerosene fuel, the highly refined hydrocarbon, into both stages of the Falcon 9 rocket. About 46,000 gallons of that kerosene fuel will be loaded aboard this morning, just as it will on launch day. In parallel with that, liquid oxygen, the cryogenic oxidizer, is now flowing, or should now be flowing, into the first stage of the Falcon 9. All that began at T-minus 35 minutes if everything is going according to the schedule this morning. Loading of oxidizer onto the upper stage won't begin until later in the countdown at about T-minus 16.5 minutes. SpaceX, as is typical, is not providing us or any of the news media at Kennedy Space Center with any real-time updates on the static fire test. However, we do know it was scheduled for 5:45 a.m. Eastern Time. We saw the crew access arm retract right on time per the timeline for that 5:45 a.m. static fire ignition time. And in the next few minutes, we expect to see some frost and vapors appear around that first stage booster as the super cold liquid oxygen is loaded aboard. That'll be a telltale signal that propellant loading is underway. SpaceX's countdown is approaching T-minus 30 minutes. And we're now seeing some of the first vapors around the strongback area out at pad 39A, indicating that propellant loading has indeed begun. So all indications are the static fire test remains on track, on schedule for 5:45 a.m. Eastern Time, 10:45 a.m. UTC. Again, this is a key step in preparation for the launch of two NASA astronauts, one astronaut from the United Arab Emirates and one Russian cosmonaut to the International Space Station. Next week, they'll be riding on this Falcon 9 rocket on the Crew Dragon Endeavour spacecraft perched atop the launch vehicle. Liftoff set for Monday morning. Crew members, as I mentioned earlier, of course, are not on the vehicle for this static fire test. They have already gone out to the pad last night for a dry dress rehearsal. They boarded The Crew Dragon Endeavour spacecraft took their seats for a few minutes to rehearse some of the procedures they'll execute on launch day, and then they disembarked from the spacecraft and then rode the elevator back to the ground level and returned to crew quarters to complete their dry dress rehearsal overnight. And with the crew now safely back in the crew quarters away from the launch pad, all personnel have now been evacuated from the launch complex area in preparation for this morning's static fire. Coming up on T-minus 22 minutes, you can see some of the vapors continuing to increase around the first stage booster as the liquid oxygen continues to flow into that first stage. The Falcon 9 booster for this mission is a brand new vehicle. It's a designated booster 1078 in SpaceX's inventory, going for its first flight on the Crew 6 mission next week. And what you're watching now is a practice countdown, so to speak, with a test firing of the 9 Merlin engines on the first stage scheduled for 5:45 a.m. Eastern Time, 10:45 a.m. UTC at Kennedy Space Center. And now we're seeing this so-called big vent from the strong back out at pad 39A. This is part of the countdown, the standard part of the countdown. It occurs at about T-minus 20 minutes. So everything is right on track for the static fire test at 5:45 a.m. Eastern Time. This vent is of gaseous oxygen from a vent port on the strong back. That's the structure that stands vertical next to the Falcon 9 out at pad 39A. The vent is a part of the purge and thermal conditioning of the liquid oxygen line that runs vertically up the strong back from the ground level to the umbilical that leads into the liquid oxygen tank on the upper stage of the vehicle. And this purge and conditioning is in preparation for the start of flow of liquid oxygen into the second stage, beginning in about 3 minutes or so. Everything continues to look very good for the static fire test this morning at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The Falcon 9 stands 215 feet or 65 meters tall in this configuration with the Crew Dragon spacecraft on top. That's about 14 to 15 feet shorter than the Falcon 9 total height for other missions that include a payload fairing for satellite missions, for example. Those vehicles, for those missions, the Falcon 9 stands about 229 feet tall. SpaceX's countdown now approaching T-minus 15 minutes. Liquid oxygen loading should now be underway on the second stage. That's the fourth and final propellant tank to be loaded during this countdown, leading up to the ignition time of 5:45 a.m. Eastern Time. Now approaching T-minus 9 minutes in this static fire countdown at Kennedy Space Center. If you're just joining us, I'm Stephen Clark, the editor of Spaceflight Now, providing commentary and updates as SpaceX preps for this test firing of the Falcon 9 rocket at Pad 39A at 5:45 a.m. Eastern Time. So far this morning, the timeline has gone right according to plan, with the completion of the dress rehearsal overnight with the crew members that will ride this vehicle into orbit next week. They actually climbed aboard the Crew Dragon spacecraft overnight and have since now evacuated the launch pad. They're back in crew quarters a few miles away at Kennedy Space Center right now. So no personnel on the vehicle or around the launch complex right now as SpaceX prepares for this test firing at 5:45 a.m. Propellant loading began as expected at T-minus 35 minutes, back at 5:10 a.m. Eastern Time. We saw the big vent from the Strongback at the T-minus 20-minute mark, so everything has been per the timeline so far. T-minus 8 minutes now. The next major milestone will be coming at about T-minus 7 minutes. That will begin the chill down or thermal conditioning of the Merlin 1D engines on the bottom of the first stage of the Falcon 9. And that will begin at T-minus 7 minutes. T-minus 7 minutes. Engine chill down on the Falcon 9 should now be underway. This involves flowing a little bit of a super cold liquid oxygen. This is the cryogenic oxidizer that is used to help feed the Merlin engines on both stages of the Falcon 9 rocket. Down at the bottom of the first stage, this chill down involves flowing a small amount of that cryogenic fluid through the engine compartment at the very bottom of the booster. This helps thermally condition the pipes and plumbing and various components within that engine section and the engines themselves, and helps protect that hardware against the risk of damage from thermal shock when that rush of liquid oxygen chilled down several hundred degrees below zero flows through those pipes at ignition. That can cause damage or thermal shock to some of those components. And this chill down helps condition those elements, those components, for the engine startup sequence to prevent damage. T-minus 6 minutes now. Coming up in the next few moments, we would expect to, if this was a real countdown, we would expect to hear the call from launch control. We won't hear it this morning because we don't have a direct feed from the launch control center, but we would expect to hear a call momentarily for the completion of RP1 loading on the first stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. And with that, the kerosene fuel tanks on both stages should be full. Liquid oxygen loading will continue down until about T-minus 2 minutes when that loading procedure will be terminated. And then at that point, the Falcon 9 will be fully loaded with its full supply of 1 million pounds of propellant. T-minus 5 minutes and 10 seconds. In parallel with the activities on the Falcon 9 booster, if this was a real countdown, the Dragon spacecraft right now would be transitioning to what's known as startup mode. That transitions the Dragon spacecraft to internal power at the T-minus 5 minute mark. And then the next major milestone will be coming at about T-minus 4.5 minutes, and that will begin the steps to prepare for retraction of the Strongback away from the Falcon 9 rocket. And that Strongback is the vertical structure, the mast that is right now flush up against the airframe of the Falcon 9 rocket in a vertical orientation. That Strongback will be retracted to an angle of about 1.5 degrees away from the rocket in the next few moments. That process begins with the opening of clamps around the upper stage of the Falcon 9, around where the interface is between the upper stage and the bottom of the Crew Dragon spacecraft. T-minus 3 minutes, 30 seconds now. 3.5 minutes until static fire. T-minus 2 minutes, 45 seconds. Liquid oxygen loading on the first stage of the Falcon 9 rocket should be completing soon. That'll be followed by the completion of liquid oxygen loading on the upper stage. 2.5 minutes to go. T-minus 2 minutes. Mark 2 minutes until static fire. At this time, the Falcon 9 rocket should be fully loaded with its liquid oxygen and kerosene propellants. The Falcon 9 out on pad 39A weighs about 1.2 million pounds. 1 million pounds of that weight or mass is made up with propellant. 1 minute, 40 seconds. With the loading complete, the fill and drain valves on the Falcon 9 should be closing at this time to get into flight configuration, although this is, of course, not a launch attempt. It's a static fire test. 90 seconds to go. Coming up at T-minus 60 seconds, control of the countdown will be passed from the ground automated computer to the flight computer on board the Falcon 9 rocket. Minus 50 seconds. The Falcon 9's flight computer should now be in control of the remainder of the countdown. Again, the static fire test will culminate in the ignition of 9 Merlin engines at the bottom of the first stage of the Falcon 9. Those engines will run for about 7 seconds or so. Hold down clamps, hydraulic restraints will keep the Falcon 9 firmly on the ground. It will not be flying today. T-minus 20 seconds. The engine ignition sequence should begin at T-minus 3 seconds. Minus 10. Minus 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine ignition. Merlin Wendy engines now firing at pad 39A. And engine shutdown. That appeared to be a nominal duration static fire test. About 7 seconds is what we were expecting, and by my clock, that's about what we got. About a 7-second test firing out at pad 39A. Saw the plume of exhaust to come out of the flame trench on the north side of the pad, as we normally do. So visually, that appeared to be a successful static fire. However, as usual, we'll stand by for word from SpaceX and NASA later this morning on the outcome of the test. Engineers are carefully analyzing all the data from the engine performance and the performance of the various Falcon 9 systems, ground systems, make sure everything functioned just as expected. Data will lead into a launch readiness review on Saturday evening. That launch readiness review, or LRR, will involve participation from NASA, SpaceX, and other representatives that are involved in this mission. And if everything looks good, they'll give their go for the final phase of launch preparations Sunday, leading into the early morning countdown Monday morning, leading up to liftoff at 1:45 a.m. Eastern Time Monday to begin this crew's 6-month expedition to the International Space Station. With the static fire complete, the next step this morning will be the draining of those propellants on the Falcon 9. Falcon 9 was, of course, fully loaded with its full 1,000,000 pounds of propellant over the final 35 minutes of the countdown. Of course, only a very small fraction of that propellant was actually consumed during the static fire test. So the propellants will be drained from the tanks on both stages later this morning, and then the vehicle will be safed and secured, and personnel will be cleared to return to the pad later today to continue final launch preparations. Now, 7 minutes since the static fire test at pad 39A. Joined us live. We appreciate you, your participation and watching our coverage of this static fire test. We'll, of course, be back Sunday night with comprehensive live play-by-play commentary throughout the Crew 6 countdown and the launch of the Falcon 9 rocket to begin pursuit of the International Space Station with a crew of 4 by Commander Stephen Bowen and pilot Woody Hoberg from NASA, mission specialist Sultan Al-Niyadi from the United Arab Emirates, and Russian cosmonaut Andrei Fedyaev from Roscosmos. All 4 of these crew members heading up to the International Space Station for a 6-month expedition. Assuming the launch happens on Monday morning, the Crew Dragon spacecraft is slated to dock at the space station Tuesday. If you want to support our coverage, there's a couple of ways to do that. You can join our YouTube channel. Click the join button, and depending on which membership level you select, gain access to members-only video features we have on our YouTube channel. That really helps us continue and maintain our coverage for the growing launch cadence here on Florida Space Coast. If you're a collector, you can go to our Spaceflight Now store at shop.spaceflightnow.com to purchase the Crew 6 patch, which we have for sale there. Again, the URL for that is shop.spaceflightnow.com. We have the Crew 6 patch and other items for sale in our Spaceflight Now store. We're going to sign off from our live commentary. We'll have continuing 24/7 streaming coverage on our YouTube channel on the Launchpad live stream throughout the day and the weekend leading up to the launch on Monday morning. And we'll be back late Sunday night with a full dedicated live stream broadcast beginning late Sunday night leading up to the 1:45 a.m. Eastern Time liftoff time. We'll be following the astronauts as they make their way from crew quarters out to the pad, get into the Crew Dragon spacecraft, following along as propellants are loaded into the Falcon 9 rocket, and then we'll be tracking every step of the way as the launch vehicle makes its way into orbit, about a 10-minute ride into orbit for the Crew Dragon spacecraft until the time that it's deployed from the Falcon 9 to begin its pre-flight, about a 1-day pursuit of the space station. The first stage booster, as I mentioned during our coverage earlier this morning, is brand new. It'll be targeting a landing on one of SpaceX's drone ships out in the Atlantic Ocean. So again, thanks for joining us this morning. We'll see you again Sunday night for the final countdown and the launch of Crew 6.